we're going to actually talk a little bit about that more, comparability and all all things, CMC and clinical, and that's actually what I want to pivot to now. Um, we know that CMC is the connection between the drug used in the clinical studies and the drug that is marketed commercially and then made, of course, available to consumers. So what I want to talk through first and foremost is, why is the relationship between CMC and clinical so critical? And perhaps what does a mutually beneficial partnership between CMC and clinical look like? Koki, I'd love to hear from you on that.
Sure, let's start. Obviously, where we treat the patients is the most profound bar possible. And I think one of the key things we think about is consistency. This was addressed, but really, there's so much biological variation in cell therapy, and that's the width of a histogram. And what you're trying to do is make a very consistent drug product. So what you do is minimize all that variability so that whatever you go into the clinic, because there's human variability, when you see signs of efficacy, safety, it's from the drug mechanism and it's not from inconsistency to your drug product. And I think this is where there's such a synergy between clinical development and CMC. Clinical development always guides how we develop our drugs. Rubber meets the road, and it tells us when we're ready for phase 1, and then when we're ready for dose expansion, and then to think about pivotal. I would say the biggest thing is really consistency, and obviously there's the safety consideration, especially in allo, and then obviously everyone looks at efficacy. To Lauren's point, that's the big take home for most people.
Sure. Lauren, I'd like to give you the opportunity to perhaps expound on what Koki is saying here, that what does that mutually beneficial partnership between CMC and clinical really look like, and how do we make it, how do we even make it even better?
Yeah, well, Koki hit most of it. I think I just add maybe 2 more thoughts onto it. I think the line between CMC and clinical is much blurrier than what you see in other modalities. I think very much so in autologous, but almost equally in allogeneic as well. And the 2 things that I would bring up as examples is, you're delivering a living product at this point. So from my standpoint, CMC doesn't completely end until infusion, right? So there's still a thaw that has to happen in the clinic. There's still preparation, and there's still delivery to the patient. How long does that take? How much exposure to DMSO do we have during that time period? How do we design the product so that it can be as insulated as possible to that time frame, right? That is a very critical window, is one of the things that we've learned. And if we didn't have a fantastic relationship between the CMC teams and the clinical teams, that very important window might be overlooked, right? And it's something we really need to keep track of. We work very hard from the time we formulate the product to get it into its container and get it frozen as quickly as possible. The minutes that we save there, if we waste them once it's thawed in the clinic, becomes almost moot. So it's all one set of processes, if you will. And so and if we also look at the other end, how we look at different donor attributes, sometimes we have to ask our clinical colleagues, based on what we're seeing with a donor, is this something we're concerned about? Are we going to waste our time in manufacturing? Are we going to create something that's not going to be good once we move to the clinic? So you actually end up with this entire spectrum of clinical being involved in the starting material, clinical being involved in the end, and CMC really taking a wider approach to how far it has an influence. So again, it starts to become one and the same. It almost becomes a clinical / CMC team as opposed to 2 separate teams. We end up talking the same language, and we actually get very educated on what each other are doing, because we have to know so that we know what the impacts might be. So it ends up being a very, very tight-knit organization, just based on the realities of the product that we're making.
Sure, thank you. Koki, I want to, because there's a regulatory component to everything we're doing here. What is the regulatory component to ensuring that CMC and clinical move forward as seamlessly as possible, or kind of in lockstep together? What has your experience been with working with the regulatory component of this?
Well, I'll tell you, I'm learning every day. Our regulatory team is fantastic. And I think by definition, because they got us through that European approval, there's so much wisdom and foresight that goes in. It's a science. And to Lauren's point, interacting with Dr. Marks, interacting with Dr. Verdun at the agency, it's always a conversation. And I think what we think about is the regulatory team works with quality and actually guides CMC through the development process. So it's to anticipate what is required for an IND, what is sufficient, what is nice to have, and then to anticipate IND amendments, type 2 variations in the EMA, and then what those 5 same modules of an IND look like in the BLA, as well as BLA amendments. It's a continuous conversation across the org, as Lauren stated. And we're so integrated that we think that we've reached, a much more ideal state of operational efficiency and effectiveness just by going through this once with EMA. And I think it's what it's educating us about is really just how much you have to take into account the guidance from the FDA that is increasingly coming out with more fluency, and as they get more into the space, it's really, really helpful guidance. And I know Lauren touched upon this, but it's just that relationship is so powerful, not only with the agency, but within the organization.
Sure, thank you. This mute button does not like me today. Okay, thank you, Koki. Okay, before we move on to our next topic, I just want to make sure that we're covering, in what ways moving forward do you think we can improve the CMC clinical relationship to in fact bring more allogeneic therapies to market? Like what do we really need to work on, and what would our audience take back to their team to say, okay, if we're going to work on this, if we're going to work on anything, it needs to be this. Koki, what are your thoughts?
Well, I don't know if Lauren wanted to start, but
yeah, happy to, Koki. I think we touched on a lot of it, Aaron, already. It's really about getting tightly knit. I mentioned the uniquely tight differences between CMC and clinical and having to work together on that. Koki mentioned wrapping regulatory into that. Realistically, every single operation within the organization has to work as one as we move through this. And I think it's just becomes clearer and clearer because there is an opportunity to go faster. There's regulatory pathways that have been available, the RMAT's available, the orphan drug is available, the breakthrough is available. You see a lot of different avenues being laid out for organizations. You just have to seize it, right? And you have to select a strategy, and you have to get moving as quickly as possible. And you have to have the right amount of risk tolerance. And that's not to say you need to be reckless, right, to get through the process, but you need to have the dialogue with the agencies, and you need to pick your direction and move quickly. I think we all recognize the fact that the financial environment is not very forgiving, especially for the smaller companies at the moment. You're going to have a limited number of shots on goal. You need to have a strong conviction for what you're doing. You need to get all of your teams moving in the same direction. And frankly, just give it a go, right? Put it out there. We've seen some fantastic data in the clinics. We're seeing some great news about CMC progress that people are making, and we're seeing the regulators being open to the ideas. The stars are aligning, right? And I think the funding will start to follow as people start to take these successes and drive them later into development.